Immediately following Washington Week, join us for the state of Colorado. Janet Day, eventually we may have lower power rates, a result of a merger. Fred Brown, might there be a rerun for U.S. Senate? Plus, transportation and education. We begin at 7:27. Political editor Fred Brown. Governor Romer now wants to spend $1.5 billion in the next 5 years to fix our highways.
The governor wants to. The legislature, I think, would like to talk in terms of $100 million a year, not $100 billion. But the problem is that they don't want to make that kind of a 5-year commitment. The last time they did that, they did a school finance formula, and the governor had to chastise them toward the end of that 5-year period by saying, you know, you haven't really performed yet. You haven't produced that money.
This would be government surplus?
This would be surplus funds that are theoretically available for this sort of thing, and if you don't use them, you've got to give them back.
Among our many topics here on the state of Colorado.
This is the state of Colorado. The State of Colorado is a spontaneous discussion of the issues. Funding for the state of Colorado is provided by the Adolph Coors Foundation, the Monfort Charitable Foundation, Colorado National Bank, and the investment firm of Piper Jaffray and its employees, looking toward the future since 1895. Now, Don Kinney.
Good evening. The power base of a Colorado utility will grow. A former U.S. Senator is checking his power base to determine if he will campaign again. Political editor Fred Brown, former U.S. Senator Gary Hart is considering another race. Business reporter Janet Day, Colorado's largest electrical utility, will join with one in Texas. In a few minutes, Bert Hubbard will join us with an adjustment of air traffic to reduce noise. Auto and truck traffic along the Front Range is altered, at least a little bit, by decisions by the Regional Transportation District. Guy Kelly, RTD, struggles to decide priorities. For many students, it is back to the classroom. Brian Weber, SAT scores are slightly higher in Colorado, and a tax issue will be on the November ballot. Public Service of Colorado will join Southwestern Public Service of Amarillo. Big power consumers and average homeowners may gain with lower costs. Janet Day.
But Don, don't crank up the air conditioner just yet. These lower costs at the residential area are something way out in the future. But ultimately, you're going to see consolidations and mergers like this continue. In the continually deregulating power delivery business, bigger is better. If Public Service Company can merge with Southwestern Public Service Company of Amarillo, eventually they will have a transmission line to combine their service areas. They buy much more power, they get better rates. The theory is they can then pass those better rates on to consumers.
The easy part, they won't have to change their name.
Well, the new company has no name yet. It is the company to be named later, I suppose, because both of these companies, Public Service Company's 126 years old, Southwestern's, if not equally as old, equally well known in Western Texas, the Oklahoma Panhandle. There's a lot of history that goes with those names. They want to continue to keep them. But what's driving this is the deregulation of the energy distribution industry, but it's at the large commercial user now. What deregulation is allowing is your big energy users, a mine, a CF&I steel company, people like that, they can shop around now. Just because Public Service is in their backyard, they don't have to buy electricity from
They could
them.
reach outside the state to get their power.
They can go anywhere they want, whoever's offering them the best deal. The new laws allow, or actually require, I suppose, utilities to let other utilities use their lines. There will be a fee, of course, and that adds to the charge, but if it's still lower than what's right in your backyard, CF&I may go with Public Service. They could go with West Plains, which is of Utilicorp out of Kansas. There's Southwestern right down the road. There's anybody everywhere in the grid.
The big splash this week is the intention of this merger. But in reality, what is it? 7 federal agencies and several state agencies must bless it.
Public Utilities Commissions in 6 states must approve it, and I think there are 5 federal agencies. It's not likely to run into too many problems. Consumer advocates will keep an eye on it to see that eventually the costs are passed on. And you are going to see that in, who knows, a decade, a few years, somewhere out in the future where you can be looking through brochures that come in the mail, like from the phone companies, or even online, check your utility use on your computer and see that if I run my washing machine at noon instead of 7 p.m., and if I get my power from this company instead of that company, I can save a few bucks on my monthly bill. We will soon be able to shop around for our utility provider, much like we do our long-distance provider.
They say it will save about $700 million in the next 5 years. 1/2 of that is for labor.
Yeah, that's over a 10-year period.
10 years.
But yeah, about half of it is from elimination of jobs, whatever phrase they care to use, reduction of redundancies or whatever. But they will consolidate primarily administrative jobs. There's no need to have 2 main offices, 2 executive secretaries, 2 of this, that, and the other. So they expect about 600 people at both companies. They're not sure the split yet, will lose their jobs. And this comes after years and years and years of downsizing at Public Service.
Business reporter Janet Day of the Denver Post. U.S. Senator Hank Brown says he will not run for re-election. And ever so slowly, we are learning of people who would like to be a candidate, who would like to be a U.S. Senator. Possibly a former U.S. Senator? Fred Brown.
Don, Gary Hart has been a little hard to reach until recently. You know, there were rumors going around 3 or 4 weeks ago and that he was considering re-entering the Senate race, and of course everyone said, no, it can't be. Well, I'm sure that Peter Blake at the News did what I did, and that was to put in some calls to the senator, which he did not return, until last Tuesday. Tuesday morning. I think both of us were under the impression that this was a big exclusive. It obviously wasn't. But I think the senator is testing the waters and just trying to see what kind of reaction he got to the idea that, well, he might try to make a comeback. And the reaction, obviously, was, well, the first reaction was to the old Donna Rice business. You know, did he or didn't he? And he certainly, whatever he did or didn't do, he certainly handled it badly. And I got calls, I've gotten calls this week from everything from CNN to the National Enquirer asking about Gary Hart and, well, he can't really do this, can he, after that Donna Rice thing? In fact, the reporter at the National Enquirer said, well, would you say that the Republicans in the state are really saying, okay, big guy, come on, we're ready for you? I said, well, they wouldn't quite, but would you say that? I said, well, finally, I sort of said something like that. And now, you know, this is an interviewing technique I hadn't really thought about.
Well, now, I believe it was Paul Talmy, the pollster in Boulder, said the groundswell in Colorado would fill a flower pot.
Yes. You know, Paul's good for that. I think the problem Gary Hart has is obviously very much based on the way his 1988 presidential campaign collapsed in 1987. He says politics has grown up and that subsequent allegations of marital infidelity have not had nearly the coverage that his did. And that's true. I think the media got tired of that story after Gary Hart, and it just doesn't have the, I was almost going to say it doesn't have the legs it used to, but it doesn't have the impact it used to. And the Clinton thing was sort of a problem, but he took care of it well. Newt Gingrich's, the allegations about Newt Gingrich's affair during his first marriage were a story of a week's duration at most.
One of the Republicans responded to your question, said Gary Hart is a has-been. Well, he's kind of young to be called a has-been, isn't he?
Well, to you and me, he may be young, Don. But I think to a lot of people, you know, he was, I covered his first campaign in 1974. He energized a lot of young people who stayed with him. They were with him through that 84 presidential campaign, through the 88 campaign until 87. And those people are very discouraged, and it's going to be very hard for him to re-energize that group and hard for him to build up a new group. So that's his principal problem, is a local problem of getting volunteers to really work for him.
Brian Weber.
I think you really hit it on the head that it's not so much the Donna Rice affair, is it the effect of that, the discouragement, the disenchantment, the bitterness that he caused with those troops, and how you get that back. Ask Dick Lamb. He ran into a similar problem.
Well, he didn't have the same kind of motivation for the problem, but
he came back and
found out people had forgotten about him. He was an extremely popular governor. He had no negatives the way that Gary Hart has.
Right.
I mean, I saw a poll from Media Political Research that showed him with high name recognition, but high negatives too. So, you know, the other 5 Democratic candidates don't have any name recognition. Gary Hart, if he decides to run, would have high name recognition, but it's the wrong kind of name recognition.
This week, Hart kind of used all of this as a trial balloon. He was thinking about this a while back, backed away from it. Is he just kind of checking to see what the Fred Browns have discovered?
I think he's checking to see what kind of reaction he gets to the stories that the Fred Browns and the Peter Blakes write about his possible reentry. You know, the funny thing is, speaking of name recognition, that on the day his story came out, Paul Weissman, a state senator, announced for the Senate, and it got buried by the second day Hart stories. In fact, in the Rocky Mountain News, poor Paul was on page 27A. I counted them, 150 words.
And that leads to the pressure then that will be placed on Governor Roy Romer. If Gary Hart and high recognition don't do anything, will Roy Romer be pushed toward the Senate?
Roy Romer, I think, is constantly being pressured to run. I think he's said, well, he's not going to shut that door entirely. But what's the inducement here? We're talking about, well, Roy, wouldn't you like to save your Democratic Party from losing its filibuster-proofness? In other words, if the Democrats slip below 40 votes in the Senate, they can no longer be assured that they will be able to continue a filibuster because it takes 60 votes to shut one off. And you wouldn't be a committee chairman, you'd be in the minority, but wouldn't you like to save us from that? Well, you know, that's a very inside politics argument. And to leave a job where people have put a lot of faith in you for something so inside politics is not very tempting.
You have written on several occasions that Roy Romer says he doesn't want to run for U.S. Senate, and you believe him. It's just a question of whether he can be pushed into it.
That's exactly it. It's, you know, when Bill Clinton calls you maybe every week, I don't know that this is going on, but who knows? Maybe Bill's got that cell phone out there on that raft, saying, "Roy, have you rethought about this?" But you know, it's going to be. I'm sure he's going to get a lot of pressure. But you know, if he finally decides to do it, I'm sure he is the candidate they'd want. I'm sure he would probably win, but I think it's going to take a lot of convincing.
Political editor Fred Brown of the Denver Post. It's back to school time, and this week we learned the results of the SAT tests, which juniors and seniors took last year, and they did a little better than past years. Brian Weber?
That's right, Don. Statewide, the scores went up 11 points. Some of the local districts, Denver and Aurora, went down a little bit, but overall the state performed better than it has. It's the best improvement in 10 years, and it's a 4-year trend of improvement, which is probably the most significant part